Okay, so all this works, yeah? So the format will be that we are going to have these 2-hour-long sessions with sort of paired presentations. And altogether we have 2 hours, which means that everybody has individually 1 hour. Ideally, that means, let's say, half an hour presentation, and then we have half an hour for discussions. But, you know, you are free to allocate your time as you wish, and then face the consequences as you wish. So let me just briefly introduce at the beginning both Ethan and María Inés, and just to say as a few words as possible, so then the more time you have. So our first presenter will be Ethan Kleinberg, who's the editor-in-chief of, the top journal of historical theory, History and Theory. And he's also a leading researcher in historical time with his landmark book, Haunting History, that came out with Stanford University Press in 2017. But most recently, Ethan published Temporal Vectors and the Compass of History, which grew out of his Kostelec lecture in Bielefeld and was also published open access by Bielefeld University Press. And María Inés Mudrovcic is professor of philosophy of history at the National University of Comahue, Argentina. But currently she is at the University of Sao Paulo. And again, she is the foremost scholar of historical time in South America. And she published most recently in the Cambridge Element in the series Cambridge Elements in Historical Theory and Practice, the book Conceptualizing the History of the Present Time, which came out last year, right? 2014. So, Ethan, María Inés, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zoltan. So yeah, my thanks to Orimas and Zoltan, the Lithuanian Institute for History, and everyone for coming out. I do want to say that this Vilnius convention in the field of theory and philosophy of history, I think is just a wonderful and really important thing. Because increasingly there are fewer and fewer institutional homes for theory and philosophy of history, even though we're seeing more and more people working on it. So the idea that we can get the buy-in and the ability to come together someplace on a regular basis is a really important act. So I'm grateful for that. I also want to say, just as an aside, that I've wanted to come to Lithuania and Vilnius for a long time because of my work on the philosopher Emanuel Levinas. I wrote a book on his Talmudic lectures, and that brought me into the Gaon of Vilna and the academies that were here. And so it's really been wonderful to be able to walk around and retrace those steps, listen to those ghosts, if you know what I mean. So I'm very grateful to be here. But I'm not here to talk about Talmud, believe it or not. I'm here to talk about directionless time. And, well, as we know, the motivation for this conference is a kind of shared sense that the dominant paradigm of directional time no longer holds sway in the way it used to, whether pointing toward positive progress or catastrophic decline, two sides of a sort of similar narrative. And at least to my mind, the speakers assembled here have demonstrated this in recent publications. So the question before us is what we as historians, philosophers, theorists of history are to do in the face of this challenge, or really I'd rather to think of it as an opportunity. So Zoltan and Orimas have prompted us with some potential responses in the form of a series of questions that you can find on the website. Should we settle for presentism or fight against it, to use Francois Artaud's language? Should we stay with the trouble, to use Donna Haraway's? Should we search for time shelters, as Georgy Gospodinov's characters do, fleeing to a safe, happy past? Or should we acknowledge future disorientation and unprecedented change following Zoltan? In this talk, I'll offer my response by attempting to answer the question of what history might look like if one assumes the premise of directionless times. This is to ask what happens to history if time has no given direction. And I'll do so by arguing for a condition of temporal anarchy, out of which understandings or logics of time are constructed. And I'd say the homogeneous, universal, and unidirectional logic upon which most disciplinary history relies is just but one variant. And my contention is that the events of the past are both more temporally dynamic and forceful than this directional paradigm allows, and as such requires a mode of history attuned to this temporally anarchistic force. So the means to do so, I would say, is by recognizing the vertiginous because directionless moments when the past becomes available in the present for the future. And this is what I call the surge. We'll talk about this a little more later. Now to do so, I'm going to unpack three terms: the vortex, the constellation, and the compass. And I'll argue for a mode of history which embraces the dynamism of temporal anarchy, and as such can account for multiple alternative logics of time, or better, I'd say temporality, unfettered from the axiomatic supposition of unidirectionality and progress. Now, I do want to say I didn't bring a slide deck or a PowerPoint intentionally because I like to work, I don't even know if they're metaphors in this case, but with terms that I think work best when you're using your own imagination as to how you think they work, although it turns out conveniently, if you want to know the vortex, they put one up right behind me, so you can fall into that if you want to as we're going. Okay, so let's start with temporal anarchy. Temporal anarchy rejects the assumption that time comes pre-packaged with a direction. Now, this doesn't mean the absence of meaning. It means a condition prior to any given temporal order. And here I'd remind us all that anarchos is without a chief or a ruler, and I mean this both in terms of temporal sovereignty and temporal measure, that kind of ruler. On my view, temporal anarchy is the condition out of which multiple temporal orders are possible, though whether they are necessary is an open question, although I'd say they seem to be, for humans at least, and in our moment, the dominant ruler is a uniform and unidirectional understanding of time, fused to notions of progress and chronology. And this is what I've called in a recent article, historicist time. So in my larger project, I explore the ways that this messiness or unruliness of time and temporality is inevitably exposed in even the most orderly temporal constructions, revealing their arbitrary nature. But here today, I want to use some theoretical physics as my ally. So if we were to look to the Order of Time by Carlo Rovelli, we see he demonstrates the ways that developments in physics have come to unsettle the view of time as universal, homogeneous, and unidirectional. And Rovelli takes us through the work of Ludwig Boltzmann, Einstein, quantum physics, then gravitational loop theory, to present the current view in physics, and here I'll quote Rovelli, that there is no single time, there is a different duration for every trajectory, and time passes at different rhythms according to place and according to speed. He goes so far as to ask, and here I'll quote him again, before Einstein told us that it wasn't true, how the devil did we get into our heads that time passes everywhere at the same speed? And to this he responds, it was certainly not our direct experience of the passage of time that gave us the idea that time elapses at the same rate, always and everywhere, end quote. So the disconcerting but liberating, I would say, conclusion which emerges is that the difference between the past and the future refers only to our own blurred vision of the world. What's more, there can be multitudes of these as they are predicated on the ordering principles we enlist to determine cause and effect in time. And there's numerous ways one could do this. To quote Rovelli here, quote, there's nothing intrinsic about the flowing of time. It's only the blurred reflection of the mysterious improbability of the universe at a point in the past, end quote. So next, we should ask if physicists have abandoned the dream of a single, homogeneous, objective, directional time, why do historians still cling to it? Well, one reason is that this unidirectional chronological model of historicist time is both efficient and convenient. Now, it strikes us as natural, and here again I'll quote Ravelli, because it has gradually become the way in which we all think about time. It has filtered through school textbooks throughout the world and ended up becoming our common way of understanding time. We've turned it into our common sense, end quote. And I would say it is an incredibly efficient way of ordering things into a comprehensible sequence, and especially in tune to a certain notion of narrative order. But this efficiency hides what we can call the chronopolitics of historicism. Historicism professes neutrality and circumspection, but at the same time claims superiority by virtue of the historian's place on the temporal scale. The idea of progress over time that lies at the core of this historicist project justifies the position of those in the present as superior to that of those in the past. But crucially, it's not anyone's present. It's the present of the historian whose values are shared by their intended audience. And this is a cultural imposition that is not limited to an audience constituted only of a fraction of the social world anymore. In Ashish Nandi's words, and here I'll quote, "It will not be perhaps a gross simplification to say that the historian's history of the ahistorical," this would be those who do not have a proper disciplinary or historicist approach. The historian's history of the ahistorical, when grounded in a proper historical consciousness, is usually a history of the prehistorical, the primitive, and the pre-scientific. By way of transformative politics or cultural intervention, that history basically keeps open only one option, that of bringing the ahistoricals or prehistoricals into this version of history, end quote. The 19th and early 20th century proponents of historicism actively sought to make their understanding of time and history the only one, leveraging their position in formal education and high culture in the service of nationalist, colonial, and imperialist endeavors. Now, counterintuitively, in historicism, the concept of time itself becomes timeless, universal, homogeneous, and released from any sense of context or historical situatedness. And this can be seen in the synchronization of clock time, the repetition of calendars, and the attribution of dates. These forms of temporal management are now considered applicable to all times and places retroactively and prospectively. And this is the key underlying aspect of historicism in all its forms and its means of imposition and expansion to create what Nandi calls an imperialism of categories. And this is, to quote again, "the ability to establish such complete hegemony over the domains they cover that alternative concepts related to the domain are literally banished from human consciousness," end quote. Now, historicism established such a hegemony by ingeniously demoting and discounting alternative ways of understanding time and the past as backward, mythical, or unscientific accounts that are themselves to be explained and understood via the rules and protocols of modern scientific history. Thus, the historicist historian imposes a protocol of historicity legitimated by the historian's temporal position on the neutral and homogeneous scale of time, because we're now, what we understand is better, more scientific, more advanced, and so others need to be brought along, willingly or unwillingly. Now, it's true that figures like Nandi and Dipesh Chakrabarti, Priya Satya, and my colleague Shahzad Bashir have done excellent work exposing the political, colonial, and expansionist aspects of historicist time. Nevertheless, the intellectual unmasking of how historicism operates seems to have made little difference to the practice of professional history, and I'd say this continues to be the case. In part, because the ultimate aim of scholars such as Ronka and Droysen, and those who followed, was to imbricate their form of doing history into the very academic institutions that endure. Unidirectional historicist time continues, and I'd say all disciplinary history continues to work upon its temporal scale, even as physicists and historians alike grow increasingly disenchanted with its powers. Now here, Paul Feyerabend's comments on epistemological ruptures sums up our moment well, so I'll quote him. When the epistemological terms begin to shift, or the old ways become weak, even the most puritanical rationalist will then be forced to stop reasoning and to use propaganda and coercion. Not because some of his reasons have ceased to be valid, but because the psychological conditions which make them effective and capable of influencing others have disappeared. And what is the use of an argument that leaves people unmoved, end quote. So, here we are, unmoved by the arguments for historicism and directional progressive time, but seemingly unable to think otherwise. It's a methodological and epistemological bind. To follow Feyerabend a bit further, we should say that, quote, the first step in our criticism of familiar concepts and procedures, such as directional time, must be to break the circle. We must invent a new conceptual system that suspends or clashes with the most carefully established observational results, confounds the most plausible theoretical principles, and introduces perceptions that cannot form part of the existing perceptual world, end quote. Despite its familiarity, its utility, its comfort, and its ease, we must break with directional time and with historicism, though, as noted, this is certainly easier said than done. To be honest, my own touchstones, like Walter Benjamin or Chakrabarty, themselves remain ensnared by the processual historicist logic, despite their criticisms of it. And I'd say this is the case of Paul Feyerabend at times as well. Thus, any attempt to move beyond directional time requires that we rethink the origins of what we have come to consider orderly time to be. And while I don't have the space to do this in a substantive fashion here, I'll paint a portrait with broad strokes to keep us going. So, how and when does time start? I'd say it's when what was past carries into the present that the need to organize and categorize the relation becomes pressing. This accounting for the past and the present then impacts our ability to move into the future. Now, it is not necessary that what we commonly consider past is consigned to a before, because this isn't the case in other cosmologies of time. Nevertheless, it is the entrance or arrival of the past into the present that presses us to coordinate and to organize time. Now, this force coming from the past is what I call the surge, and I, in other works, use the analogy of the ocean, or you could imagine a wave of water pushing forward. I use the analogy of electricity, a surge of current, or of sound. That can also be quite deafening or overwhelming, but it'd be quite gentle. Or one can even think of the wind, which can affect us and have different frequencies or vibrations, different amounts of force. This is the surge, and I think that's the way the past comes to us. Now, being attuned to it often is difficult when it's at its most delicate or fragile, although when it comes at us with gale force, then things become more clear, or we want to react. I think Walter Benjamin's discussion of origins in the introduction to his book on the Trauerspiel provides a useful, though imperfect, analogy to this process of arrival and then conceptualization. For Benjamin, and I quote him here, origin, Ursprung, although an entirely historical category, has nevertheless nothing to do with Genesis, Entstehung. The term origin is not intended to describe the process by which the existent came into being, but rather to describe that which emerges from the process of becoming and disappearance, end quote. The surge does not describe the process by which the past or future event comes into being, but it's the site of becoming and disappearance. Here I quote Benjamin again, "That which is original is never revealed in the naked and manifest existence of the factual. Its rhythm is apparent only to a dual insight. On the one hand, it needs to be recognized as a process of restoration and reestablishment, but on the other hand, and precisely because of this, as something imperfect and incomplete," end quote. And I think we can align this with Rovelli's analysis, and here I quote Rovelli, that the quantization of time implies that almost all values of time t do not exist. It's not possible to think of duration as continuous. We must think of it as discontinuous, not as something that flows uniformly, but as something that in a certain sense jumps, kangaroo-like, from one value to another, end quote. What appears to us is not the manifest existence of the factual, but a revenant or an arrivant. In the case of the past, it's not the reclamation of the event itself, but an imperfect and incomplete reappearance. And Benjamin goes on to tell us that, and here I quote him again, origin is a vortex, der Strudel. A vortex in the stream of becoming, and in its current, it swallows the material involved in the process of genesis. So I want to actually turn this around to consider the way that what Benjamin calls origin comes from the vortex, comes from the surge, which swallows the material involved in the process of ontologizing. So here, time is not a river that flows downstream from past to present to future. It's not directional. Instead, it's a vortex in which past, present, and future events swirl. They're pulled down, they're pushed up, they're sucked under in one place to reappear in another, or thrown in who knows what direction. And this casts, I think, a very different light on Benjamin's analysis that, quote, "There takes place in every original phenomenon a determination of the form in which an idea will constantly confront the historical world until it is revealed, fulfilled in the totality of its history," end quote. The determination of the form in the present is projected into the past, thus imposing a sort of genesis retrospectively. And this de facto genesis then becomes the basis for an explanatory narrative of cause and effect, which effaces the role of the surge in bringing this origin, this process of appearing and disappearing to the present. In effect, the force and anarchy of the vortex is replaced by a normative order of progress from past to present to future, where the value of the future is always superior to that of the past. But if we look again to Rovelli's account of quantum gravity, we see that this progressive linear trajectory is not a necessary component. Quote, "The theory does not describe how things evolve in time. The theory describes how things change one in respect to the others, how things happen in the world in relation to each other," end quote. So if we follow this logic, then progress is removed from the equation, and we're no longer working with the properties of better and worse, as is the case with historicist time. And for Rovelli, this is not a metaphor. Here I quote him, "The world is not so much made of stones as of fleeting sounds or of waves moving through the sea," end quote. The vortex names the vertiginous surge where temporal distinctions collapse. Past, present, and future are no longer neatly arranged. They swirl together in a turbulent relation. So the next question becomes how we can maintain the force and temporal dynamism of the surge and the vortex in a representational strategy to make sense of the past without arresting its dynamic temporal qualities or replicating the unidirectional status quo. And I think this can be done, again, looking to Walter Benjamin, through what he calls the constellation. Now, if the vortex is the site where the past swirls into the present, the constellation is the means to map it at any given moment. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Benjamin writes of the Jetztzeit, the now time, in which the past flashes up at a moment of danger. But I'm actually more interested in the formulations proffered for the Trauerspiel, but especially for one convolute in his Passagenwerk, the Arcades project, and this is convolute N. And here again, I'm going to caution us that Benjamin is himself a fish swimming in the stream of the modernist moment. Convolute N is titled On the Theory of Knowledge, Theory of Progress. So we must be wary in following his lead. If we are to deploy the constellation while retaining the dynamism of temporal anarchy, we must resist the pull of the dialectic and its teleological entailments. Even so, I think there's much to be gained because, as my colleague Uli Plas has stated, the motivating idea behind constellation is to avoid the logic of method as a kind of path to truth, hard truth. Method inevitably means explaining something unknown by means of something one already knows. The truths method discovers tend to be those for which one is already looking, leading to the sort of retrospective emplotment where specific events in the past appear to inevitably lead toward and justify our moment in the present. The constellation is a kind of anti-method, which is the realm of play and the realm of experimentation. And as such, it's an aesthetic representation, Darstellung, the realm of poesis, making, ontologizing, potentially in new or unexpected ways. You could look at Shahzad Bashir's online monograph, which actually works in a sort of constellatory or convolute way. You can surprise yourself reading it. It's hard sometimes to surprise yourself in a codex. But for Benjamin, he wants to take this to what he calls the dialectical image, the dialektische Bild. Though my preference, again, is to think of dialectic here in its original Greek sense rather than the post-Hegelian 19th century variant. So, in convolute N3, Benjamin writes, and here I quote him, the historical index of the image not only says that they belong to a particular time, it says above all that they attain to legibility only at a particular time, end quote. So on my view, the surge is the force that enables the historical image to attain legibility at a particular time. That's what brings it to our attention. And I'll continue with Benjamin. And indeed, this acceding to legibility constitutes a critical point in the movement at their interior. Every present day is determined by the images that are synchronic with it. Each now is the now of a particular recognizability. It's not what is past casts its light on what is present, or what is present its light on what is past. Rather, image is that wherein what has been comes together in a flash with the now to form a constellation, end quote. So this is the moment of capture, where the image of the past can be represented, but it is neither enduring nor definitive. If the vortex is the site from which historical reconstruction can be drawn, the constellation is the representational snapshot. If the vortex is turbulence, the constellation is the pattern we discern in it. Of course, the pattern we see is likewise beholden to the epistemological web in which we are ensnared. So here too, the key is maintaining dynamism. There's refraction all the way through. And I'll quote Benjamin again, to thinking belongs the movement as well as the arrest of thoughts, end quote. Benjamin goes on to continue to tell us where thinking comes to a standstill in a constellation saturated with tensions, there the dialectical image appears. So, for Benjamin, image is dialectics at a standstill, but in my usage, the constellation is an image of the vortex at a standstill. Not temporal in nature, but figural, bildig. Now, the image may be at a standstill, but the vortex from which it is drawn does not stop churning. The swirl of past, present, and future is not arrested. The constellation is drawn from the past, which presents itself to us at a given moment, just as one can draw a map of the stars. But like the stars in the night sky, the points do not connect themselves. It's we who draw the lines, and we who make the shapes. It's not a neutral observation. It's not objective in the way that historicist models are. But the shapes are not arbitrary. They emerge from an attunement to the material itself. And here we have to remember the stars and planets we form into the constellation are themselves not static, either spatially or temporally. They continue to move across space, and crucially, the image we see when we look into the night sky is from a different time, emitted long ago in the past, only just becoming legible to us in our present. Thus, the materiality of the constellation should not be taken as the fixed actuality of the past or naturalized as an essential presentation. It's the capture or arrest of a moment, but one that is enabled by the surge, arriving through the vortex, and in this way the constellation is a representation of the way past, present, and future are aligned at a given moment. It can and will change, and we must change with it. And this is why Benjamin insists that regarding the historical image, quote, resolute refusal of the concept of timeless truth is in order. And I'd say this is especially so regarding the imposition of timeless time. So the next, and I suppose the last question for me, is how we know where to look, which way to turn. And here I turn to a new compass. And the compass I propose is a sort of surge detector that seeks the sites of historical intervention when issues from the past return in ways that make them legible in the present. These arrivants connect to immediate concerns, but also repel us from our attraction to the straight line of established historical narrative. This understanding of history and mode of argument is predicated on the moment before the orderly organization of time and even the categories of past, present, and future. The anachrony of the surge appearing via the vortex, this unrestrained mingling of past, present, and future, is surely disorienting compared to the seemingly atemporal neutrality of a magnetic compass always pointing north. Then again, any space where we're not in control is also a space where change is possible. And I think this should give us hope. Rather than retracing the same paths, perhaps there are new ones, new ways we could go. So the new compass of history is a device to remind us that the past does not lie in a single direction, on a single line waiting to be uncovered. It does not provide us with a map or a chart or a set of rules to follow. The compass is a sort of attunement elsewhere toward ruptures, detours, absences, and of course, I say this for you, Zoltan, ghosts. It asks the historian to turn from the forward march of chronology and instead to attend to the surge of the past into the present, to the way multiple times and voices overlapped, contradict, or haunt. So this is a compass that surely does not give us certainty. There's no true north here. It does not promise the shortest route from evidence to narrative. Instead, it reminds us that history is also a matter of choice, of orientation, of which direction we decide to face. And in this way, it breaks with the supposed neutrality of historicism, both in terms of universal homogeneous time, but also in terms of a historian as a neutral actor, what I've called time's scribe. As such, it opens the discipline to other registers, ethical, theoretical, fictional, mystical, and insists that our task is not simply to reconstruct what was, but to reckon with what continues, with what was silenced, what refuses to stay buried, to return to the earlier term, to what emerges. The new compass of history, then, is an invitation to move otherwise, to write otherwise, to let history more than a straight road from a then to a now. So to conclude, in the end, the vortex, the constellation, and the compass are not just metaphors. They are historiographical tools for an age in which historicist time has lost its authority. They're a heuristic for practicing history, when and if we accept that time has no single direction. In this way, history is no longer a value-laden endeavor charting a straight line from the past to the present with the goal of justifying or vilifying our place in the now. To return to Paul Feyerabend, quote, "Knowledge so conceived isn't a series of self-consistent theories that converge toward an ideal view. It's not a gradual approach to the truth. It is rather an ever-increasing ocean of mutually incompatible alternatives, each single theory, each fairy tale, each myth that is part of the collection forcing the others into greater articulation." That's the part I like. But then Feyerabend continues, "and all of them contributing via the process of competition to the development of consciousness," and here he loses me by reverting to the progressive logic of time, which in so many ways he opposes. So looking at the ways time is ordered and organized in response to temporal anarchy, we can come to the conclusion, we can realize there's not a singular logic of time or history, but multiple possible ways of organizing them in response to the surge. If temporal anarchy is a total other, the surge is the moment or means of mediation, when we look to make sense of the past that surges or arrives or emerges and moves us. But it's also a chance to interrogate that moment. It's not a perspectivalism, where the same event is seen from multiple viewpoints. Neither is it a parallelism that results from multiple competing narratives that do not intersect or touch, which I think is largely where we are now. Instead, starting from the surge, this approach accepts that there are multiple competing logics of time and ways of organizing the past which can be represented as a constellation. These differing representations may not agree or use the same system, but by taking each logic of history seriously, we're forced to interrogate the axiomatic claims upon which any given logic of history is founded. So if one takes the possibility of temporal anarchy seriously, then one lights upon the possibility of taking a multiplicity of possible temporalities and chronologies seriously without privileging any one. For history, this means we are free, I would even say obligated, to explore temporalities beyond historicism. This is a history built on the destabilized grounds of temporal anarchy. And if we embrace it as a force that cannot be tamed, but can be mediated when we are properly attuned, then the historian's task is not to follow along a timeline, but to navigate a turbulent and temporal series of waters, reading the swirls of the vortex, discerning shifting constellations, and ultimately steering by a compass that can only guide us if we are willing to accept the work and challenge of a constant recalibration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan. Great time management, a bit longer. But yeah, it was very fine. So that means that it leaves us about 25 minutes to discuss Ethan's paper. I myself have a lot of questions. I would also encourage the panelists, of course, to engage with one another. So whenever there is the opportunity, just, feel free just to raise your hand, sneak in, and so forth. So, but we can... That also means that if María, if you have right away something that you have, let's say, the priority, otherwise, and I will just collect questions, and until we start to collect the questions, I will ask my first questions, if you don't mind, because I have the authority to do so. And I think Davide and Martin will pass around with the microphone if any of you has questions. So then to start or to kick off the discussion, I have basically two different things. And one question is about, okay, so we started, let's say, a very heavyweight theoretical presentation, of course, with a lot of concepts. So then one of the main questions would be if you are able to relate, of course, the sort of dynamism of temporal anarchy and the sort of the scenario of historical change entailed by that you depict to actual events in the world, either current or past. So just in order to sort of put some flesh to the bone and then help people to understand how exactly you think historical change takes place in temporal anarchy or in the conditions of temporal anarchy. And then that also relates, I think it's a very important aspect as well, to what extent is what you say is normative and to what extent what you say you think is descriptive. So do you want to make sense of the world as it is, as you think change takes place? Or you would like to break free actively from something that you feel restraining, and in that sense you sort of outline a normative agenda?
Right. So let's start with whether it's normative. Well, I'd say it's normative insofar as it is prescriptive, but I'd say in some ways it's an audacious prescription, in other ways it's more modest, because the audacious prescription is actually to challenge historians to employ a different model of time or temporality in the way they organize their histories and the logic that they employ. So this sounds like, okay, that's great. Now, the part where it becomes difficult is that if what I'm saying about temporal anarchy holds, that it's that out of which logics of time can be generated, then if I'm offering a logic of causality myself, it's going to be one. And so really what I'm trying to do is set a sort of a condition under which actually each of these logics of time or ways of organizing causality are really placed under a pressure, a kind of pressure where you have to be able to explain actually the logic by which you think causation occurs. For me personally, I like moving into this relational mode where we move out of the notion that something like time even works on a before and an after, and instead it works on a relational notion of change where it's, in the case of doing a history, it's in relation to what are we describing the way the change has happened, and in relation to what are we understanding the series of events, as opposed to setting it up immediately assuming a before and an after, which is the scaffold on which we're going to place it. So if we're moving in that relational mode, I think that changes the dynamic. Now, one of the things it does allow is for two competing or even contradictory, and this is where I'd go to Fire Robin, modes of understanding a past event to be placed side by side to each other. And one, of course, can feel echoes of my deconstructive approach to the past here, because they need not agree for me to be able to put them in fact, it's usually better if they don't agree, for me to be able to put them side by side to understand the different ways they're being organized. That in itself is a kind of heuristic to help us get inside of the way the past is being organized in the present. So, yeah, so then of course I guess the next question is, so what would be an example of this, or what would be one way? I mean, again, I could point to looking at Shahzad Bashir's discussion of Islamic temporalities, which actually takes something that was assumed to be uniform and work in a certain cosmology based on a set of religious precepts to show how actually there are multiple logics or cosmology at work depending on how you look at it. And then, of course, the form of the book, it reinforces the thesis of the book in this case, because it's an online book where you are moving in what's set up as a constellation or nodes. And the way you move from node to node is going to then set up these logics in a different series. So it's, I mean, one of the things that are great and terrible about the Codex, the book that you can open and move to, is it's very convenient. But of course, if you put something before and something after, that's going to do something also to the logic. So I'm really asking for radical experimentation on the aesthetic side. That's the constellation isn't just a way of looking up at the sky. It's actually a way of us forming the points in new and different ways, of creating different snapshots. I mean, I guess one example could be my Levinas book, where that's a case that a certain history had always been written under secular precepts about what was developed and what happened. But if you start taking a transcendent logic that God works in a different way and meaning or ethics comes from a different place, then all of a sudden you have a different way of reading and understanding the text. I don't think it's unique to that case. I think this can be applied in multiple cases.
All right, thank you. So we have 6 questions, and I would suggest that we do pairs. So we have 2 questions, and then Ethan answers, and then 2 more, and then Ethan answers, 2 more, Ethan answers. Yeah. And then we will see if there is more time, whether you can answer in a brief way or whether it takes more, it needs more elaboration. So then the first two would be Blake and Priya, here at the front, and then Johan and Eva, and then Balázs and Paul Roth.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'll be brief given the other questions. I noticed a number of times in the presentation you said if. There was a sort of qualifying if we are in a time of temporal anarchy or not. And it seemed to me that if we are, and if we want to consider historicity and the possibilities of history in terms of there being anarchy or a vortex, to what degree is that one contested? Do we all have to agree to do that, or should we try and convince people that we are in a vortex? And secondly, I was wondering if, to what degree is the surge necessary for this? Do we have to have a surge of the past, which in your metaphor and description of the surge sounds like something ephemeral, right? There are moments of surge, that surges come and go. So I was wondering, sort of a two-part question, how do we know where we are, and to what degree is a surge necessary to open up the possibilities of thinking historically very differently?
Thank you. I think that was a great way to start. And my question is, I'm very sympathetic, obviously, to everything you said. It's sort of a question about, what one value that I would think, or one methodological value that I think is sort of universally, I would even say almost transcendentally important to historians, is the idea of context, right? That we're always supposed to take into account context when we're explaining, to sort of do the good work of explaining why a particular historical outcome came to be, right? I hope everybody's with me. People can say if they disagree. So when I think about some of the history that has been stuck in this historicist kind of progressive imagination, one of the big problems, every time I go back to, if I'm trying to work on a historical problem myself, I find that the histories in that vein are often just really bad history, right? So if instead of thinking of this as sort of an entirely new, searching for a whole new paradigm, I mean, to me, part of the issue is that there's just been a lot of bad history, and a lot of history that doesn't take into account context. Because once you take into account context, you're sort of, another word for context is that constellation. Like, I'll give you an example. I'm right now trying to explain this moment in 1801, when Ranjit Singh, who becomes the king, the head of this new kingdom in Punjab, why does he choose that moment to proclaim himself a monarch, a Maharaja, something more than just a Raja, okay? And when I look at the other histories, the earlier histories, most of them, the problem is that either they're looking at it nostalgically, like this was a betrayal of the Republican ideals that were prevailing among the Sikh polities in Punjab at that time, or this was not a betrayal, but this was something very progressive of the creation of the Sikh nation, or something like. None of them actually take into account what was going on in 1801 that would have provoked Ranjit Singh to think, hey, maybe this is a time when I should declare myself Maharaja. Like, there's certain very contingent things going on in that moment that he would have seen, the past that's informing him, the future that he's seeing, all this vortex, right, that snapshot. I mean, part of the reason we failed to understand it is that we've failed as historians in the basic task of looking at that context and empathizing, taking someone like Ranjit Singh as our contemporary in the way that the page sort of asks us to do, or sort of points out that we are doing automatically when we are being historians. And so what's subjective here, the subjective component we can bring to it is not just, we are subjectively connecting these dots, but the old-fashioned value of sort of understanding the subjectivity of the historical figures that we're trying to understand. Like, what was Ranjit Singh's outlook when he was making that decision to declare himself a Maharaja, and what was the colonial context in which he was operating. So I just wonder, if we're making this maybe too challenging for us by just, maybe the challenge is simply to do much better history than what's been done so far. So to do good history.
Okay, so let's, now I have to remember the first question. No, that's fine, that's fine. It's my disorderly thinking. But I guess I'd start with whether the surge is necessary. I would say the surge is necessary because I think that's how things become legible to us at any given moment. Even in the example that Priya gave us, it likely was these previous other histories were attuned to certain things that were important to them and trying to prove a certain case at a moment, but in this moment, there's something else that has come up that's become legible that for our moment that we want to get at, which actually can then provide a different sort of answer. It's an answer that then we could decide we're going to adjudicate, that it's a preferable answer to the prior ones, and you can certainly do it using the historicist logic, although in some ways I know that in the way you do your history, you chafe against it. So you want to take some aspects of it, which I think is the source criticism, applying pressure to what was previously said. But in other ways, of course, you are rejecting some of these progressivist logics that might actually lead to those other bad histories. In fact, I'd say the reason there are so many poor histories, in your view, is because of a lazy adherence to a historicist processual time, which gets me to the vortex. I think the vortex is, my conditional if of temporal anarchy is more of a rhetorical device to see whether I can convince you all that that's the case. Because if temporal anarchy is what I say it is, and you could look to some interesting thinkers who, Freud, like especially at the turn of the century, where Freud and Bergson, Husserl, Heidegger, Hans Reichenbach, they're all fascinated by this moment out of which something is organized that becomes time or temporality for us. But if you get to that moment before, that's not an orderly moment. And in fact, that's why I describe it as a kind of total other. When it's in a realm of temporal anarchy, this is the realm where we don't know and don't understand. So there's an amount of mediation. And then the amount of mediation, of course, that's where you have to try and decide how you're going to make sense. And I think that's where a logic of time or temporality is generated. So for me, it's not conditional, it's not an if, but it isn't something that I could point to and empirically show. But the minute I empirically demonstrate, I've already decided to sort it. But I want to press people to think about the why and how they're sorting it, the why and how they're deciding which of these ways of imploding this narrative is the one that they want to choose and use. But then I also, and this is maybe where it gets, historians don't want to do it, because I want them, and this is actually quite radically historicist, not in the temporal way, but in the initial idea that the historian is implicated in the history they write. In fact, this is Koselleck's discussion of vortexes, is the problem of the historian being absolutely impossible for them to be able to know whether it's their projection onto the past that's leading them to the conclusion or the past itself. And I guess the last thing I would say is I don't agree that, so maybe I'm a voice in the wind, I don't think context is the necessary dominant form of history, and I would even argue that if you go back certainly to figures like Herodotus and Thucydides, the context isn't what's driving the story. That's actually, this is what historicism in many ways is reacting against, this idea that what you're trying to do is craft some sort of universal message that everyone can recognize in the history, that can have a kind of didactic or historia magistra vitae function. And that becomes more, that's why Thucydides, it can make up speeches. It doesn't matter that you're getting the context wrong or completely inventing. What matters is actually you're getting at something that's universally true for all the people reading this, that can move across time, that's unrelated to the moment in what it wrote. History has worked that way in the past. It's worked that way both in its theological registers and also in these now like canonical figures. So I don't see why we need to assume that history has to continue to work in the way it has since it's become disciplined. Maybe we decide we think that's better, but that's what I would want to argue out. Why do we think it's better? Why do we think it's a better way of ordering it? What does it do? It probably would tell us more about our present, actually, than about the past, I would say.
Then is Johan, and then Eva.
Thank you so much. It's very, very interesting. And I was just thinking about the Rovelli that you mentioned in the beginning. And in his book, At Order of Time, he does the things that you described. It sort of destabilizes and sort of disrupts the Newtonian singular homogeneous time. And then, but he does then reckon after doing that we are sort of, the messiness that emerges from it might be too messy to actually live by. And he goes on to reinvent the time to some degree, at least, by turning to philosophers and other people. Sort of, so do you have similar concerns here that maybe it's just too messy already to orient us or to live by in some way or form this temporal anarchy?
Thank you very much. I have to say I love your idea of temporal anarchy. I think it's a very catchy concept. And we definitely need it. But my other question would be, we do everything to multiply our idea of times. And we know that all of us have different ideas. And the time is gender-specific, culture-specific, time-specific, and so on and so forth. So my question would be, is your idea of temporal anarchy paradoxically can help us to look for something that unify all these many different ideas of time? And perhaps we also should look for this commonality which is so needed in current times. And the second question, very quick one, is you were referring to physicists, which I was very much happy about. But after you switched to thinkers, and I wonder how this reference to physics actually helped you to develop the idea of temporal anarchy, because I have a feeling that you could do this idea without this. And you also refer to Feyerabend, and we know what he thinks about science. It's a magic and myth, fairy tale. So I wonder how it would go, this, transdisciplinary approach that you presented. Thank you.
Okay, so first, no, can't be too messy. But you knew I was going to say that to begin with. I don't think that it can be too messy. I do think it is dangerous in a certain way, because of course the way out of which one can decide they're going to order or recalibrate or make up the past might not be the one that you and I want it to be. But I'd say right now we're in a pretty dangerous moment anyway, and what's even more dangerous is the way that bad actors operating in bad faith are mimicking the disciplinary historicist model to make their history look indistinguishable, even though it's done in bad faith. But then it's able to credential it and it's able to find an audience. And part of what I'm arguing for are tools to get underneath that, to say just because it looks like a duck doesn't mean it's a duck. Or also, why do we follow ducks? Why can't we follow something else? Maybe foxes. So I really do want to get to the messiness. The problem with the messiness, as I alluded to, is that is a kind of total other. So it's in that mediating moment that I'm trying to get at what's built up and by who. Turns out it would go over to Eva's question. You find a lot of people building it up and working it up in these specific moments of time that you could look to, but many of them also are really caught up still within the very logic they're contesting. So the answers they give tend to not allow it to be totally unruly. They get to a certain point, and then they're like, so now I have to recalibrate, right? So even Feyerabend, who completely tears down science in one version of the book, comes back at the end and says, but that was too much, and at this moment in time, we actually need to, we know it's not true, but we need to have some truths, because otherwise it's going to be relativism. I'm not afraid of the kind of relativism that would necessarily ensue, because I think actually we're very good at sorting those things out amongst ourselves and working out a system based on it. But this gets to the other point. I don't think the physicists are necessary. I think the physicists are interesting because they are claiming to be scientists, and historians, for the most part, want to be scientists too. And so then that leads to an interesting contradiction, because if the physicists have given up on this, why are the historians hanging on to it? If the people that they see themselves as aligned with in a certain way don't think this way anymore, why do the historians keep doing it? But then to push it a step further, I don't think then you have to follow the physicists' logic. I think it's good to work with them, but I think they also are, again, sort of caught in a certain kind of homogeneous logic. Now, as you say, the danger is we're moving to a radical messiness, but I do think counterintuitively, we can start creating a zone of what I'd call solidarity. And the zone of solidarity would be in that agreement that we're going to adjudicate the axiomatic principles on which these different ones are connected. And that actually can create zones of convergence. The problem, I would say, today is we're running in these silos or these parallels, which is different than the perspectivalism of the early historicists, because the narrative written by a right-wing nationalist in the United States has a different origin event and a different end than that by, say, a progressivist historian. And if you have a different object you're looking at as beginning and place it goes as end, then there's nowhere that these can touch. Then there's no dialogue, and I'd say there's no possibility of convergence or solidarity. So I'm saying we need to get underneath that to create that zone where where these are touching. And it may be messiness, it may be argument, but I think that's also the possibility where we can find convergence, or we can advocate for convergence. So in the book itself, in this larger book, that's the end game, is that zone of convergence.
More questions than the original 6, but we still have time for two quick questions from Balázs and Paul. But please be really on time.
Yeah, I would like to ask one question about the, so to say, conceptual architectonic of what you presented, which was very beautiful, and one timid historical question. And the conceptual question is that what does basically the compass do with constellations? Yes, because like metaphorically, if you take compass metaphorically, it's of course spacing. Yes, I mean, but we are talking not about space but about time. Then it's somehow temporalizing it. Yes, if it is temporalizing, it is historicizing it to a certain extent. Now, what is the historicization that the compass is doing? Is there a non-historicist historicization, so to say? And I connected to this the historical question, so to say, is basically, isn't this a too, how to say, reductionist understanding of historicism that you presented? So isn't it too much the Popperian concept of historicism as this kind of like linear progressivist? And if we go back to 19th century German, or even Dilthey, or even to Ortega y Gasset, so Croce, whoever would be still in the kind of orbit of historicism, then they would argue much closer to what you are saying than what you made out of the historicist tradition.
Hi, yes. So I was a little unclear. Your talk about temporality seemed at times to bleed over into talk about causality. So I was not at all certain how or in what ways you separated talk of temporality from causality. And this led to a worry about possible ways of understanding your remarks about temporal anarchy and what causal anarchy would mean in this context. And then the final remark, which is meant to play off the way I heard Priya's question, that rather than talking about anarchy, perhaps your point might be better served by talking about radical contingency, that rather than thinking of either time or causality as determinative relationships, we we realize when looking retrospectively, these are very contingently related and related in ways where people seize on the contingencies or they don't, but nothing predetermines whether the moment will move one way or the other. So yeah, so time and causality, how the notion of anarchy plays here, and whether the notion of radical contingency would do the same work for you that you are using the term anarchy for.
Okay. Wait, Balazs, in like really quickly, tell me the first part, because the conceptual part of the question. Oh, right, compass. Yeah, okay, got it. Yes. So so this is a great question. These have all been great questions. The compass, to my mind, actually, the reason it's not the spatial compass pointing north, which actually, even with the compass pointing north, it does have a temporal aspect that's smuggled into it. When you talk about true north or a moral compass or any of these things, they're already at play in it. And so what I would hope to do is expose that the time and space are always interrelated in these, that they're never alone, and that they're quite messy. And so I want this compass actually to be able to sort of toggle between those two. So it's pointing out to us that we're never in a clean sense that we know exactly where we're going or when we're going. And in fact, that's sort of that would be the sort of messiness or dynamism that I'm trying to keep at play. So that would be how the compass works. Second part of the question again. Oh yeah. Okay. So this right. So historicism is notoriously messy, and it would take too long. But what I would say is I did write a piece called "Deconstructing Historicist Time," Time Scribe. You can look it up. It's in History and Theory. But I didn't edit that one. That was guest edited. I would never edit my own thing. But in that, I talk about what I call historicist A, which is that early moment, the sort of original historicist moment, and then historicist B, which is the Popper moment. But I also explain the way there is a teleological and progressivist aspect to the A moment. It's different than what Popper is talking about. But even when you get to figures like Chakrabarty, he sees the way the one gets caught up in the other, that you don't really escape it, whether you're in Dilthey or in Droysen or in Ronca. So I do work through all those, because I agree, it's a very messy, people still don't really know what historicism is because it's used so many ways, so I do try to disaggregate them. But that's a big question. Or it's a different paper that I wrote. So contingency instead of the anarchy. And well, let's go to the temporality issue first. I would argue that it's in the case of historicist time or temporality that both chronology and causality are fused in a way that's tied to a notion of progress. So anytime you're talking about historicist time or historicist temporality, it already is talking about causality. And that's, again, this moved very quickly, but the idea is to move away from that being assumed, that you're not assuming a logic of causality on chronology just because you're talking about time or temporality, that you could be talking about time or temporality, and that's not where the space of understanding, say, causal logics has to occur. It can occur differently. Now, I'd have to sort of work up an imaginative way of doing it, but probably you could find it in something like understandings of the Mayan calendar, for instance, where it's just a different ordering of how what's caused is related to where time is. So you can find examples of it, and so those sort of need to be fleshed out. I think contingency is great, but I think in some ways contingency is too weak for what I want to posit as the kind of, I think retrospectively you can see things as contingent, one leading to the other, but if we're talking about before we're sort of creating a logic of time, then I do think you're talking about something that just doesn't have the rules, even to have a contingency yet, or at least that's what I'm trying to work up. So I do take it, and I really do have to think hard about it, because maybe that is a worthwhile swap. But at least at this moment, I'm looking for something that is more than radical contingency, or something less that has less meaning, maybe we could say, than radical contingency. Even radical contingency is sort of an explanation. The temporal anarchy part is prior to an explanation. So I guess that's how a preliminary answer.
All right, so thank you very much, Ethan Kleinberg. And
well, can you hear me? Yes. First of all, I want to thank a lot of much Professor Zoltan and Professor Aurisma for inviting me to attend this conference and be with you and discuss so many interesting topics. I have no so fluent English like Ethan, so I am going to speak slowly, and if you cannot understand some word or some expression, please, I am not going to be ashamed if you stop me and say, can you repeat it, please? I prepare a PowerPoint, something writing, in order to help you. Yes? Can you understand me? Ah, yeah, it's only okay. Till now. Don't be optimist. Till now. Well, my paper is from my paper when I have sent to Zoltan have changed many times. The first title is From Time as a Noun and to Time as a Relation, a shift in a metaphor or a shift in an ontology. I am going to explain this. This one, yes. The title of this workshop, Directionless Times and the Question of History, assumes that times or times won't have a direction, and this direction is now lost, and that such loss bears some relation to the practice of history. The question I intend to address is, for whom is this question even possible? And why should a supposed lack of direction in time be troubling or provoke discomfort? My argument is that the claim that we are living through directionless time does not point to a recent collapse, but rather rather to a fatigue in an ontology that won't succeed in imposing its particular way of temporalizing the world as if it were universal. Rather than a loss, we are facing an ontological friction that forces us to rethink from where, from whom, in what language we continue to say history. The second one. I begin with an observation made by Chris Lawrence in 2021. This observation is a comment with Ethan. Chris Lawrence comment on you. And I take this comment as a central part of my exposition today. I am quoting. Christian Lawrence said in this occasion, taking plural time seriously implies first and foremost that uniform and exclusive temporal labels are strictly banned because there is no uniform we. Following this warning, I am to show that one of the most pervasive conceptual errors in debates about temporality is that they take place without attention to the grammar in which they are inscribed. Thus, the fundamental question began, who is the we that can talk about times, futures, past, presence, plurality of times, temporal scales, and so on? Who is the we that can say time passes quickly, we don't have time, we waste time, or we lose time? At first feature of that we, to which we ourselves belong, and within which this workshop is framed, is that we inhabit a world in which time is a noun, a concept, a thing that can be named, a discrete category. However, there are other words, other we, other grammars, in which there is no time in the proper sense of the word. Words in which time cannot be spoken of, in which time is not a noun that can be bare predicates, in which time cannot be said to be fast or accelerated, for instance. There are we who inhabit grammars or words that lack any expression equivalent to time. And for this reason, those we cannot speak of time as if it were something real, something that passes, that can be wasted or managed. Words allow we who inhabit them to think, speak, or act. They are ontologies that deal with assumptions of the kind of beings, truths, and the criteria that constitute a word. This is very important. The boundary of a word is marked by the impossibility of thinking, of naming a this. Do you remember the Foucault's Chinese encyclopedia? This was a this. When a this disturbs or breaks into the commonplace through which a word unfolds, it unsettles and irritates. Ontology is not a theory of being in the universal sense, but a situated mode of worlding, the result of human capacity to tell stories that define who we are and how we live. And I'm following here Winter's idea that we are homo narrans. The first thesis of this paper, then, is that one cannot speak, debate, or discuss time independently, in isolation, or without attending to the word or the ontology of the we, within which the very question of time becomes possible. Debates about time are always related to the other elements of the word or ontology in which they are inscribed. The title of this workshop, Directionless Times and the Question of History, it is self-possible only within a certain grammar. within a certain ontology. At first approximation, we may say that this expression is intelligibly or belong to the toolbox of ideas and beliefs of the Western world. There have been many ways of describing the West. I prefer a definition of the words given by Latour and Chakrabarty in a conversation together. And they say that the West is the Christian philosophy of history, secularized plus carbon. However, given the global context we are currently facing and the theme that brings us together here, I am interested in analyzing the definition of the West proposed by Javier Milei. Do you know, everybody knows Javier Milei? Lamentable. Poor people. Well, on January 23 of this year, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, spoke for the second time at the World Economic Forum in Davos. His speech expressed what he believes the West must undertake: a culture battle against woke ideology. The West, I am quoting here, don't be afraid. I am quoting, you can look it in YouTube, the proper word, but I transcribe it properly. He said, the West, the cathedral, the West, the historical cathedral of the world, went astray at some point in the 20th century. It has been infected by woke ideology, a mental virus, a cancer that must be extirpated and that has colonized Western civilization. The West must return to the past of progress and give a way to a new golden age. For Milei, the West represents the pinnacle of the species, the human species, the fertile ground of its Greco-Roman heritage, where Judeo-Christian values planted the seed of something unprecedented in human history. However, wokeism came to reverse these fundamental pillars. Woke ideology is a regime of single thought upheld by various institutions, like this institution, around the world. Feminism, diversity, inclusion, equity, immigration, abortion, environmentalism, gender ideology, among others. They are all heads of the same creatures. In its most extreme version, Milei said, gender ideology, for instance, constitution, plain and simple child abuses. They are pedophiles. Milei, ignoring all the debates we have had within the field of theory of history regarding critiques of Western lineal and absolute time, ends its speech by exhorting world leaders to look backwards. And remember what Churchill once said, the farther back you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. Evidently, Milei has not read Chris Lawrence Warman. For me, in my view, Milei's defense of the West is ontological and epistemic. Broadly speaking, it seeks to restore a modern Christian, masculine, white, productivistic, and individualistic order. The dominant narrative of the West has shaped foundational categories that determine what is to be understood as human, object, life, thought, the sacred. It has consolidated the division between us and them, the division between humans and non-humans, between subject and object. We, Western and Westernized subjects, like me, for example, are individuals separated not only from other categories of human, women, people of color, or indigenous people, but also from an external world, nature, which pre-exists us and which can objectively represent, by the same token, control. The world as planet, as external nature, contains us. It is outside, and we are in it. This nature functions as a container, much like other things, such as time, such as space. As Martin Luther King put it, this results in a thing-oriented society. The woke ideology would invert these poles, giving agency to the non-human, recognizing the right of the non-male, giving floor to the subordinate, making visible the power device that support modern hierarchies, etc., etc., etc. Here, I want to return to the Derrida warnings about the violence of every enunciation without an epistemic regime that has not been dismantled. There is no innocent language. Every form of writing reproduces the violence of the logos it claims to challenge. If we accept Derrida's critique, then indigenous people, nature, and regionalized bodies cannot be granted full voice within Western grammar without reproducing the very violence of reason that once silenced him. In indigenous humanities, in Black studies, in ecological discourse of care of nature, or in the call for reparation for Afro-descendants, there is often a process of domestication of the other. Recognition policies do not suspend ontological violence. They reorganize it. The problem is not merely of that given voice, but of who decides what counts as voice, what counts as subject, what counts as time, what counts as word. At this point, we may think as a solution, as Arthur Escobar does, of these songs where the Western we and the we of the other worlds encounter one and another as songs of openness, as pluriversal contact songs. For authors like Escobar, it is possible to shift and transition from a object-oriented design like the West to a life-centered design, to build bridges. There is another position, the position of intergovernmental platform of biodiversity and ecosystem services conceptual present. My pronunciation is not very good. He presented this platform this year, which represents itself as a concept or an analytical tool to address the link between nature and people while incorporate diverse scientific disciplines and knowledge systems, including indigenous and local knowledge. I really think that positions like Escobar and like this platform are overtly optimistic, are too optimistic in assuming that grammars of the similar as the substantialist and the relational can be articulated through platform or entangled concept. As shown in this diagram, Western categories are superimposed and prevail without achieving an articulate. At this point, I agree with Dilip Menon that Euro-European theory provides our existing academic interpretation of the world in various ways. Whereas most expression of the modern grammar operates as context-free universal, this is not the case in other worlds inhabited by other we, who hold ideas and practices that are socially located and thus necessary contingent, where Eurocentric universalism has no place. In this slide, I attempt to graphically represent a word of substance and a word of relation. Relationality entails a very different ontology of the human, far from the radical separating of objects and subjects, of selves from environment. Relationality must be understood as a fundamental condition of existence and reality, not as a connection between pre-existing objects or entities. Time, space, and beings are results of activities and relation, and in no way things, subjects, or containers that precede those relations. Relationality cannot be fully grasped as a concept. In the next slide, in the left side of the slide, I show concepts from the Western we that have no translation in relational words. And in the right side, show expression mostly from the global south that are likewise not fully understandable within the Western world. I will take up some of these notions that are directly related to the topic that brings us together here. I want to stress that when the West encounters other cultures, dissolves the problem of time into the framework of multiplicity and plurality of time and temporalities. What I want to what I wish to emphasize is that the topic of multiple temporalities appear as the corollary of the other we, of whom historiography gives account. Other we, other worlds, other temporalities. But why do we believe we that the others have other times? In our West cultural and cognitive world, we are accustomed to the notion that time is an autonomous and abstract conceptual domain. We refer to the abstract conceptual domain as time itself. This time itself is the medium in which what historians call facts occur. Among newer, time did not exist in itself. It was not independent of events. In an attempt to translate this experience, Evan Pritchard refers to ecological time and occupational time. In the case of newer, time does not appear as a container separated from events. This temporal experience emerges from daily practices and relationships. The concept of time is also absent in certain living cultures, such among Amawanda people who live in Amazon. I know some people from this culture. I was very lucky. There is no word that means time in Amawanda. For this reason, the Amawanda cannot live in other time simply because they do not recognize any like time. To summarize and to be brutally clear, if I have a banana, for example, I can say that apples, pears, grapes, and other fruits, and there is a multiplicity of fruits. Why? Because I possess the general concept of fruit, which allows me to group and encompass them, all of them, as different instantiations of the term. Following this example, I cannot say that nor the Amawanda people, the Wishi, the Mapuche who lives in Patagonia, or medieval European population, for instance, have other times, other temporalities, or that there are multiple times, simply because there is no universal conceptual of time, no time in itself that could encompass them all, and of which these people would be more or less different instantiation. When one cannot confuse relational time with substantive time, the concept of an abstract, empty, and linear time is a conquest and colonization of Western culture, which became hegemonic. To sharpen terms, my critique that does not abolish the analytical use of multiple temporalities to court. Within Western substantialist grammar, where time functions as a discrete noun-like container, the pluralization of time is coherent and often fruitful. We speak about biological time, geological time, astronomical time, Koselleck's strata, Brodels, Longue-Udre, etc., etc. The problem emerges, and this is very important, with this conceptual device multiple times, is transposed beyond its home grammar and used to describe relational words in which there is no time to pluralize. Hence, the trap of temporal multiplicities. The other, we do not have other orders of time, other orders of regime of histories. They do not organize past, present, and future differently. The problem of temporal multiplicity arises from the violence of wanting to read or make visible the other through the grammar of the same. This problem arises clearly, and I want you to give an empirical example that I live when I arrived to Brazil. The problem arises clearly in the ontological invalidity of the marco temporal framework in Brazil, which attempts to delimit indigenous territories through chronological demarcation. The marco temporal is a legal thesis formulated in 2009 by the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil to defend the ownership of indigenous lands. It establishes that indigenous people have right to their land only if they were occupying it on the date of the promulgation of Brazil Constitution, October 5, 1988. In other words, the marco temporal determines a before and after through a chronological cut on a linear timeline from which lands are recognized or not. The tacit assumption of a global, linearly shared, universal time underlying the Brazil marco temporal denies the notion of ancestrality held by indigenous people. From the standpoint of modern grammar, ancestrality is unintelligible as a principle that shapes a constant bond with being, community, Mother Earth, and universe. Indigenous people are left only with incommensurability of action to take back their lands. Between the marco temporal of Western grammar and the ancestrality of indigenous people, what I call ontological friction takes place. Struggle from land ownerships a moment in which the similar ways of reading the world arise with political and moral implication. The concept of ontological friction does not delegitimize indigenous legal strategies, but rather shows that those litigations occur within unresolved epistemic violence. The same occurs with the concept of Anthropocene. I am not going, for reason of time, to speak about Anthropocene here. The another case of ontological friction is the so-called gender question and the LGBTQ plus community that I call subject in boxes. No? There are communities that do not recognize gender problem. And finally, I want to tell this. What if that within is truly other, does not come from the past or from the margins, but from the heart of our own technology? Artificial intelligence are not merely tools. They write, decide, create, make mistakes, imitate us, and overflow us. They are no longer our station by entities that suggest that in a future they will have a form of agency without flesh, without death, without time, as we conceive it. Perhaps they have no time, no history, no memory, no war. Perhaps they are gestating a more than human ontology without memory, without land, without cosmos, without death. No histories. The issue is to show that the different we inhabit worlds, that there are not absolutely commensurably, that untranslatability exists, and in its face what emerges is a negotiation, almost always conflictive and therefore political. Between such worlds, no dialogue is possible without acknowledging ontological asymmetry. Western categories impose violence when they translate what resists translation, as I have attempted to show in the case of Marco Temporal in Brazil. In conceptualizing the history of the present time, 2021, I propose the concept vivir con. Unlike Escobar, I do not suppose harmonious transition between worlds, but a situated practice of conflictual coexistence. It is not about designing the common, but about surviving together without fully translating one another. This is what I call vivir con. It is a concept meant to describe a some ontological friction, an encounter between different grammars, and it should not be understood as a shared present, but a situated political negotiation between diverse ontologies, and therefore contingent. A non-hegemonic contingent agreement that constitutes a form of practical coexistence between ontological diverse worlds, which does not require full translation, operates locally, recognizes ontological friction. To conclude, it is important to stress that rationality is not invoked here as a remedy or as an ontological vantage point from which to resolve the tension of substantialist frameworks. It is simple one and another other grammars, neither purer nor more just, that enables different forms of worldling. The aim is not to replace one regime with another, but to remain attentive to the friction that emerge when different grammars, when different ontologies meet, and to the contingent, often unstable arrangement that allow them to coexist without absorption. That is why vivir con is not about inhabiting harmony, but about remaining at the edge of ontological discomfort. to stop thinking in terms of a uniform we, as Chris Loren once proposed, is to try to inhabit the uncertain encounters of the similar grammars. And that means learning to duel in directionless time. That's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, María Inés. That leaves us with about 20 minutes before we go to a coffee/lunch break. And I suggest that we proceed in the same way, that we are going to have this, we bundle the questions, 2 questions at a time, and then María Inés answers accordingly. And again, Ethan, if you want something as a panelist right away.
I've spoken a lot. So.
All right. So, and just to connect the 2 presentations that we had so far. So when with Ethan we saw a problematization of, the historicist time, right? And then you had a sort of a counter offer to that. Then I think with María Inés we saw the problematization of multiple temporalities, which is the reigning conceptual framework given to the crisis of historical time, without abandoning it, but sort of fine-tuning it to as emerging out of the South American context as well. So it's a very interesting thing, of course, would be also to learn how the 2 presentations to speak to one another. And I don't know if you know Nitin Sinha, you referred to him. I think it's a different book, but he just published one on against the fetishization of multiple time or multiple temporalities. In just a moment, let me look it up. It's just a recent book that came out that might
Yes,
fetishization of plural
I
time.
have read, but there is, I think, that it conserves the linearly under the book. It's not the same thesis that I sustain in the paper.
Oh no. No.
It's very different because it has a linear time under the book. This appeared this year.
Yeah, it appeared.
Yes,
It
I
appeared
read
this
it.
year.
I read
Yeah.
it too.
I haven't read it. I just know that it exists, but I will also need to get into it. Yeah.
I was compelled to.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Can you give me the pen, please? Pen.
Pen.
Okay. Thank you.
Got it. All right. Then again, just to kick off the discussion, I will ask my question first, and I hope you don't mind if I go back to the question of V's, right?
The question of?
V.
V. Yes.
V.
V.
V. The different V's.
We? Who we?
Yeah,
who
the question
we?
of...
We?
No.
We, Western?
No. The different V's. You say that there are multiple
I am
V's.
No.
No.
I have to say something. Hola?
Yeah.
I have to say something. In the first International History and Theory meeting, we were invited to beer after the sessions, and the most important thing in the session occurs not in the meeting, but in the bar. And everybody was rather drunker, and my English is not so good. I am not fluent at all, and I remember that I was speaking about we blah 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 blah, we blah 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 blah. In front of me, I cannot remember. Don't ask me the name because I don't remember. A person, a boy say, "You are not we." And first, I thought that I was not well explained. My English is not good, so. But I white, I blue eyes, I'm blonde eyes. But you are not we. Well, I understand. Why I am not the West? Why I don't belong to the West? Because you was born in Argentina. This is the answer. And for first in my life, I realized in the first conference that I don't believe to the West. I went because I added another word, a westernized people. Yeah? Yeah, you have to say who we be.
When you said that, of course, there are the different V's all over the world.
Yes.
And then what you want to avoid is, of course, the Western assumption of the universalizing V, which I believe that, of course, there is present, but not every V in the Western world is a universalizing V either. But I want to return to the main question, that the conclusion part, right? So once you have the encounter of the different V's, and once you acknowledge that, of course, it's a conflictual encounter with untranslatables and so forth, what happens?
You have no solution, but we are in a better position than years before, because we can realize that there's a conflict, and we can be more respectful for it. But in my opinion, always the culture, the hegemonized culture, is win always. But for us, the only thing that is, we realize that there is an ontological friction, and something is not good, and we have to pay attention to this point in order to study and to understand the other. It's impossible. In one slide, in this, in which slide? In this slide, the ontological incommunity and the violence. Marco temporal doesn't translate. And Ubuntu, that is a communal, not the individualist, doesn't translate. So we have not the possibility. The only possibility is to realize, to be respectful, and not be violent.
Just to push this question a bit further, because I think the fact that...
I think we cannot historize them because we impose them a form of narrating that presupposes a time that the other words don't have. So you can write history continue with writing, among other things, but you have to realize that history belongs to the West. Yes? And when you are speaking about other people, you don't have that simply that they have others of time, others of regime of historicity. They are different, and I am going to be the effort to understand, and probably my words are not okay, something like this. History, of course, in the West is hegemonic.
Thank you very much, Maria, Inés. I'm fully with you. You know that I am very much promoting indigenizing the future and bringing indigenous thought into academic arena. But I have a question, because from this presentation, it seems like you are building a dichotomy between West and indigenous. While in reality, when we visited Mapuche, do you remember what Sergio was saying? You know, he said, do not expect me to play an indigenous. He was fully equipped with computers and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So what I'm saying is that for heuristic reason, we might build this dichotomy between Western and indigenous worldview, but in reality, many indigenous groups would not like this idea, because they also want to learn the Western way of thinking about the world, and vice versa. For example, what is going on in contemporary humanities, so-called spatial turn, right? That we speak more about space, or at least we spoke 20 years, for last 20 years, we spoke more about space than about time, because time is so typical for Western thinking, and space is more typical for indigenous. Is non-intentional synchronization between, you know, these different cosmologies and ontologies. So my question is, do we really do something good for humanities in general, or for some our worldviews, by enhancing this kind of dichotomies, or rather we should focus and enhance a synchronization or building a vision of the past that would compromise these different categories of thinking about the past, like time, space, subjectivity, and so on and so forth.
Yes, I remember very well the encounter, and I continue speaking, especially with a woman. And do you remember that the woman was pregnant, and like a stupid Occidental Westernized woman? I like her. You are very happy. You are going to have a baby. And the stupid question, which will her name? No, and she told me something like Juana, but with how do you say, sorrow face? No, why? Is there a problem with the baby? No. No, because we don't put the name of the baby, because we don't know how's the baby. We only put the baby for obtaining the ID of Argentina ID. Don't you put the name of the baby? No, because we don't know what is the baby. We put the baby after 3 or 4 years, when we know the baby and the relation that the baby is with the context. If he loves dogs, plants, another is a leader. And we change the name several times in their lives. It's not the name at 7 years and 10 years. I call these people hybrid. They don't accept at all the Western civilization, but they adapt. They are really hybrid. And I learned a lot when I began to work in Brazil. Because I taught in a postgraduate with postgraduate students, and at the end of the classroom was sitting a pupil. He doesn't speak at all. And then when I asked the theme of the thesis, he said nothing, like, how do you say baile? Dance, like a dance, no? And he was rejected 3 times in 3 universities. Why, I asked. The first time, he was studying history. The first time because he wrote without chronology. If you realize our chronology is Judeo-Christians, nowadays in the 21st cycle we are using before Christ and after Christ. And he didn't write any chronology. He gave me the paper, and the authority of the faculty said this is for folklore, not for history. Then he wrote the dates, and he was rejected again because the days were not correct and because it was as a dance. But the third time he was accepted because not because the writing, but because who was the chief of the postgrad, and he danced in my class. It's not really a dance. He was proud, no? It took me 15 days to, and he tried to explain the time as a result of the dance and the bound. When they go to the and put the head on the land, they are showing something, and something very. I'm not optimistic with Bridge. I think that the very grammar, especially from 18th and 19th century, especially in 19th century where all the social disciplines were formed, anthropology, history, economy, psychology. Psychology at the end changed the concept of soul from the church to the concept of psyche, no? In the Third Republic. At the end of the 18th century. The grammar is not easier to adapt to other grammars. Other grammars have more elements to try to learn our language, to learn our custom, because they disappear. Because the only thing they disappear, I think so.